problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
So, welcome to William Blake Live. I think today I'd like to begin. I kind of really struggled with how to deal with this today, but I want to kind of do a moment of silence for all of the things happening in the United States, particularly the recent deaths of George Floyd and the protests afterward, and just to kind of bear witness to that, and then we'll get to our thing. So a moment of silence. Okay, thanks. Today we have Paul Yoder, and I'm excited. We're going to talk about swans, more Jerusalem, and more birds. We're just going to get lots of birds today. So I'm really interested. And Paul just finished. He's an emeritus professor. He retired in 2017. But he specialized in what he calls the really long 18th century, which is roughly Milton to Keats, but particularly Milton to Keats, but particularly Milton and Blake. And he's also published on Alexander Pope, Samuel Richardson, Thomas Gray, and Wordsworth. And most recently, and I'm assuming, I don't know if this had to do with Jim Rivera's collection, the stuff on Dylan and Blake, or was that separate?
It was something separate. I did review Rivera's book though.
Oh, okay, cool, awesome.
Yeah, but no. When I retired, I was hoping to move away, but my in-laws were here and we couldn't.
Yeah.
Luckily, the Blake archive or the Dylan archives in Tulsa, 4 hours away.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. So I was able to get in actually.
Wow.
So I started doing, for a while at least, I was doing a bunch of work on. I was teaching Dylan as well at school.
Yeah.
So I started doing a bunch of work on Dylan and Romanticism, and I gave a paper at the first Dylan symposium last year, but I kind of miss Jerusalem.
Yeah, no, I get it. I always do that. Like I always branch out. I think Blake's kind of a figure like that, where you branch out for a while. You're like, I'm tired of this. And then you branch out and then you're like, okay, I'm kind of missing him. So like let's just start with your own history with William Blake. Why did you start reading him?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this actually. I went to a Catholic high school, and this was probably about 1970, when they still had the weird little clunky film strips, where they would play the vinyl record, and every time it would click, you're supposed to move the film strip forward. There was one of them that talked about Blake and his vision of angels in the trees when he was a kid, and I was just I thought, okay, this is what I want to see. After that, I don't know, I ended up at LSU and studied with Jim Bork, and we read some stuff, but then all of a sudden we read Milton, like out of the blue. I mean, it was, looking back on it now, I would not have had the nerve to do that, I don't think. But that was kind of my introduction. And then, honestly, he sent me to Ohio State to study with Les Tannenbaum. And then by that point, by the time I was ready to do my PhD work, Bob Gleckner was the chair at Duke, and they had some money. And so I got to go there.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine like just reading Milton. Like you didn't read anything before that. That was just part of here's.
Well, I think we'd read, it was a Romanticism class. And I think we'd read The Marriage and The Tiger and the Lamb, pretty much. I don't think he had us do Urizen. But it was just crazy. It caught us completely off guard. But I just thought it was really exciting.
Yeah.
And I've always been drawn to Blake and to the challenge of the whole thing.
Mm.
I taught him when I was a grad student, and one of my students back then just said, he's so loud, that the poetry was so loud. And, once all this hammering and banging and everything else, and I like his vision of how systemic the problems are, and it's all the same problem, just at different levels and different manifestations.
Well, and I like the idea. I think what you said really, really resonates with me, this sense that it's sort of this ongoing thing, right? It's this ongoing thing, and it's hard to I think part of the frustration is part of the point in that sense.
Well, and I like the fact that I don't think he necessarily always knows what he's saying, but if what I used to tell my students, if you honestly believe that God is the imagination, that Jesus is the imagination, then you got to go wherever that takes you, regardless of what you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, Blake says in his letters, I wrote some of this stuff against my will. And, I really like that.
Yeah. There's a sense in which it wasn't up to him, right? That kind of sense that, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, inspiration comes and you got to go.
Yeah. So tell me a bit, you seem to have it's so interesting. I think, and I don't know, maybe this is not quite correct. I'm not sure, but my sense is that there are many different types of Blake scholars. I think there are some Blake scholars who just really like the early stuff. But I also think that even the scholars who like the late stuff, they usually like one of the three sort of longer prophecies, like Milton or Jerusalem, right? Or even the Four Zoas, even though what that is obviously up to debate. But what is it about Jerusalem that particularly speaks to you, and why did you come to it, and this plate in particular?
Yeah. Well, the first time I read it was with Les Tannenbaum in a class on gender dynamics and romanticism. And, this was about 1981, 82. And, nobody knew anything about Jerusalem back then. We didn't know anything about, what was going on in that. It was, this was before Paley's book came out, before any of the book link studies really were out.
Yeah.
And we're all just kind of crashing around in there trying to figure out what Jerusalem is about. And I did my final paper on it for the class, and on chapter 3, because I couldn't leave it alone. And I worked out a whole system for attempts at vision, and this whole, all that, it was a, grad student paper,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I worked out this whole system, but and it kind of worked, at least at the time. And I thought, I had no intention of doing my PhD work back then. I wanted to go home. I was going to get married, all this stuff. So it was way too big a topic. So I just shelved it for about 3 years while I was teaching freshman comp and stuff like that. And then when I finally got to Duke, I knew what my dissertation was going to be on. This was going to be on this. But when I went back and read the poem again, I just didn't believe what I had said the first time. So I kind of had to rethink everything, because I was pretty much a synchronist the first time through. Oh, yes, it's all one big visionary moment, stuff like that. But when I went back and read the poem, there's a story there.
Yeah.
And I just set about, and the longer I waited, it took me 20 years to write my book, but, and it for 150 pages. But, the more I worked with it, I just don't think that the synchronic reading works.
Oh, interesting.
And that there is this draw of narrative. And I think, like most people, I got caught up with the scene we talked about a couple of weeks ago with the Los and his Spectre.
Yeah.
I mean, that scene just, the whole way it unfolds, the back and forth, just the arguing with yourself. I love the way that, I mean, I always can just imagine Lowe standing in front of the furnace and, his shadow is up against the wall, and then all of a sudden it just starts talking to him,
Yeah.
And it's just bitchy, the Spectre just doesn't want to do the work. He's mad,
Yeah.
um, so even the help is unruly here, and it just goes on, but
yeah. I mean, that moment is like so. It just reminds me of writing my dissertation, and like having that part of you that's like, no, 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 the whole time, right? And like trying to like get it to just calm down a little bit and do it. Like, come on, like,
Yeah, nobody cares. They're all lying to you. Just...
Cool. Well, let's take a closer look. If you want to bring up the plate. You said you wanted to talk primarily about plate 11.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, well, let me pull it up here if I can. This may take a second.
That's cool.
Well, let's see. Oops. Oh, there we are. Okay. Come on. There we are.
Do you
Let's see. I think I got it here.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
How's that?
Rock on. Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Yeah,
I've always been baffled by this plate. I don't think it really fits anywhere. At least the images. One of the things I do think about Blake is that I think we not that this plate is not difficult, but I think we tend to make him more difficult than he really is. And one of the things is it's kind of creed about illuminations versus illustrations and things like that. But particularly in Jerusalem, I've always found that a fair number of the illuminations are actually illustrations.
Okay.
In many ways. Even Lowe's talking to his Spectre, as stylized as that is, that's the scene that's going on. Other scenes where the daughters, or one of the daughters, is deceiving each other, and she's got the secret in her left hand behind her back, and that scene is depicted.
Yeah.
There's nothing like this anywhere in Blake's poetry.
Right.
There are just no references to anything like this. And so I'm kind of okay. I've been away from Jerusalem for a while. I figured, come back, let's try something new. And so I thought, well, okay, let's just tackle this. See what we can come up with. As it happens, I'm a sort of amateur birder.
Like bird watcher, or like
yeah. My backyard birds, but when we travel now, we've gotten to where we schedule birding stuff.
Okay, cool.
And in fact, we went to London just before the turn of the year to see the Blake exhibit at the Tate. And frankly, one of the highlights for me, aside from the copy B, the highlight for me really was spending the afternoon at Hyde Park with the swans. I mean, it was just incredible.
Yeah.
Because I just immersed myself in swans. I don't know. I like reading about birds. I like knowing about birds. I like watching birds, but I don't know squat about swans, or at least I didn't.
Where did the bird thing come from? Like, I think birds are pretty. Like, how did it become like a thing for you?
Well, I've had a number of health problems over the years, and in 1999, I had my second heart surgery. In 2004, I had throat cancer.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, what those mean, though, is you spend time convalescing at home. We have a second story deck off of our kitchen, and I just started feeding the birds.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, well, I had noticed it at my dad's house that they had the cardinals coming right up to their windows, and I realized, oh wait, there's seeds out there. So I figured if I want the birds to come to the window, put the seeds out, and they come.
Yeah, it
And
seems an interesting kind of
just
thing.
cataloging them, and then we went to the Australasian Romanticism meeting a few years ago that Peter Otto hosted. And, man, Australian birding was way cool. Black swans, ibises. I saw cormorants.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, all the stuff that, because, Milton talks about cormorants. Satan is sitting squat like a cormorant in the tree. But I've never seen a cormorant.
Yeah.
Like I have now.
Yeah.
And they are spooky looking.
Cool.
And then a couple of years ago, actually at ICR, I wandered into a panel on John Clare or something, and it was all about birds.
So there's bird studies emerging, is what you're saying, in Romanticism. Okay. Cool.
So, you want to ask questions? What do you want? You want me to just
sure. I mean, just go let's just get into the image and kind of what you're sort of seeing with this image and how it ties into your understanding of Jerusalem and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I think the weird thing is that our knee-jerk reaction for this is to go to Leda and the Swan. And that seems to be where everybody seems to start. And I think that's just wrong. For one thing, this is apparently a female swan. My wife and I had a big discussion about this last night. But it does, the swan does appear to have breasts, such as it is. And she seemed to think it was female. And if it is, then this ain't Leda.
Right.
And so if this is part of the Leda story, then this has to be Helen. This is the offspring of Leda and the Swan, maybe. Yeah. But that really doesn't make any sense. Gleckner does kind of get there though, but that's because he starts with the specter swan on plate 71. The specter swan kind of kissing the woman's toe or nibbling her toe or whatever.
Do you have an image of that we can look at?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it might be.
Let me get back to the
reference
here.
That swan is just so weird though. Like it's just such a weird pose.
Yeah. Well, and we can talk about that too in a minute. Okay, but here's the. Can you see this?
Yeah.
See? Yeah. And so see, here's the specter swan. Presumably it's a swan, but you can the wings, and then now what Gleckner does is he first reads this. He says, well, obviously this is Leda and the Swan. And okay, but then using that, he reads it backwards to see Leda and the Swan in plate 11.
Right.
And I mean they are related. There's so much in Jerusalem about the gods of Priam. So maybe Leda's supposed to be implied in there somewhere. But the other thing is, if we go back here, all right, is with the transformation, there are accounts of humans transforming into swans in literature.
Right.
The one that most people go to is Achilles and Cygnus. Cygnus and this is in Ovid. I don't think this is in the Iliad. Cygnus is the son of Neptune. He's impervious to swords and spears. So Achilles holds him down and is strangling him with his own helmet straps. When Neptune turns Cygnus into a swan.
Okay.
And there are images that Blake would have had access to, probably, earlier engravings that emphasize, that had the thigh muscles here, the legs, the human legs. But what they also tend to overlook is, which I did not know until a few days ago, is apparently in Ovid, Cygnus turns into a swan 3 different times in 3 different situations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So which one?
And only one of those has anything to do with the Iliad.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, I've just gotten so swamped in all this stuff,
yeah.
So I keep looking at, okay, so what else? You look at Blake's, I've been approaching the whole project. First of all, I read up on swans, sort of the natural history of swans. There are about 7 or 8 different kinds of swans, including one I just discovered that's named after Thomas Buick, who was a wood engraver contemporary with Blake.
Wow.
I've pretty much convinced myself that even if he may not have known Blake, Blake almost certainly knew his work.
Right.
And he wrote a very famous and a very important history of British birds.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I mean, and was one of the things that I really enjoy about working with an autodidact like Blake is that it's almost impossible to tell what he actually would have known without kind of just trying to learn as much as you can yourself.
Right.
And it really doesn't matter much where you start, because there's just so much of it.
Yeah. And like like you said, like his reading was so varied and so different, like who knows, right? But
yeah, but just to give you an example of some of the things, how the natural history stuff has paid off a little bit. Let me close this and see if I can pull this other image up. Here we go. Okay. Now, one of the things that happens, and this is just crazy, both Erdmann and then Gleckner want to read the swan as some sort of stand-in for Blake himself.
Okay.
Well, I think there was a tendency early on to try to read Blake self-consciously into everything, and plus, though, and this is where we get these tradition of swans in Blake's work, because there are basically 3 phases for that. There's this very early phase where the swan is just the object of desire, and that's in There Is No Natural Religion and The Little Boy Lost.
Okay.
You see the child in the same pose. In There Is No Natural Religion, the child is reaching for a swan. And in The Little Boy Lost, the swan is actually hidden in the title of the poem. And then you get these 3 images of swans that are kind of like vehicles. And one is on plate 11 of America, where the young man is riding the swan, looking backward. Another one is the title page for the Poems of Mr. Thomas Gray. And the other one is an ad for a book by Dodsley, of all things. And the swans are holding coins in their mouths. Yeah. So there's this kind of mid-period where people are riding swans. But it's that Pindar connection, because the one on Homer, and let me see if I got this here.
There are a few comments coming in, so I want to get to it as soon as you're.
Yeah, we'll go. Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
So Rebecca talks about Bewick's British Birds, which was revolutionary in terms of technical process, blockwood engraving, but is the bird book in chapter 1 of Jane Eyre, which is a classic in the 1840s.
I'm sorry, say it again. I missed part of
that. Bewick's British Birds was revolutionary in terms of technical process, and it's also the bird book that features in chapter 1 of Jane Eyre. So it's like really popular, apparently. That's Rebecca Nesbitt.
Oh, wow, cool.
David Fallons talks about to add to the literary swans, Horace's Odes 2.20 maybe describes the immortal poet as a swan, possibly the origin of the swan song, but that swan was male. I wondered whether this one might be be weeping Jerusalem. The fish lady immersed in the ocean of materiality is Vela. Or Vala.
I've always found this quite a mystifying plate, but it's definitely a kind of feminine swan. It was just, I suppose, it was linked to some of the ideas of like creativity in the lines themselves. Made me wonder if there's an echo of Horace. But as you say, it's very difficult to know what he read and what he knew. But yeah, the lady reminds me a little bit of the some of the pictures of Babylon elsewhere, the kind of the pearls, the extravagant hair, but it's definitely like one of the fishes in the grey illustrations as well.
I'm so kind of weirded out by like this idea that maybe the Vala is immersed in the ocean underneath the swan, but there's a fish there that looks like it's either dead, and the swan seems to be like sitting in the lake, kind of.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of meeting of kind of opposites plates, which reminds me a bit of the lily as well, which I think is at the beginning of chapter 4, where they're kind of there's that famous sort of embrace of possibly two female figures on the lily, kind of on the surface. Bane is sort of possibly linked to the two female characters. But yeah, the dead fish is quite weird, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think there was some controversy, Paul, that you noted. Oh, you're muted, Paul. And Claire says that the swans are also serpent-like.
Yeah, but okay, several things here. One is that we generally get, like with this image here. This is Thomas Gray, or the cover, the title page, and you've got the guy riding the swan carrying the harp. You know, Gray did these Pindaric illustrations that, you know, these Pindaric odes that tend to push us toward, you know, I think this Thomas Gray Pindaric prophetic reading of the thing, of the plate. But nobody quite knows what to make of the woman here, or, you know, because Blake goes in and adds all this jewelry down here. Those things are, most of that jewelry is not on the engraved plate. That's added later. The other thing, though, and I just want to point this out, because what, you know, why the natural history stuff? Both Gleckner and both Erdmann and Gleckner want to make the swan here as etching. Okay, that this is the part of the etching process. Wicksteed thinks that she actually is kneeling down in a spring of water as penance for, as he puts it, being a woman of loose character. And he wants to read the scene as a critique of London nightlife. Yeah, you know. Erdmann and Gleckner go the other extreme and make this about being about etching. And, you know, Erdmann even says that improbably the swan is singing while it's etching. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
And then Gleckner says the bubbles are proof that it's acid that we're seeing here. Thing is, swans are very, very common on the Thames. Blake almost certainly saw swans. There's almost no way he didn't see swans. And I took this picture in December. And you can see this is the way swans eat. They dabble, and when they do, they make bubbles. You know, so my point is, it's actually a fairly realistic picture. You know, you don't have to jump to all this, you know, reach for these weird interpretations of, yes, improbably, yeah. The swan is singing while it's etching. I find that improbable, yes. But the thing is that, and this may have some bearing on the fish, is that swans don't really eat fish. They're largely herbivores. This is why they got into so much trouble with the lead sinkers and the Thames and all that stuff. You've heard those stories. Was that they if they're not dabbling on the surface of the water, they're upending to eat from the bottom of the water, from the bottom of the body of water, and they would just snap up the lead sinkers as well and were poisoning themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing here, though, as I got deeper into this stuff, was I discovered, and I hope some of y'all will know something about this, the Children of Lear, the Irish story. Does anybody know about that? L-I-R. Yeah, it's apparently a famous and important Irish folktale about a king whose children were turned into swans. Oh. And there are some 18th century poems about this. There's the Irish version is there are 4 siblings, 3 brothers and 1 girl, and the sister's name is Fionnwalla. Thomas Moore wrote a poem about her.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been finding out all this. And the thing is that the Irish King Lear, L-I-R, and the English King Lear, L-E-A-R, are not in reality related as far as I've been able to find. But what I would argue is that Blake's exactly the kind of writer who would conflate them. And what I've started noticing as well is that there are 3 text passages that are important to this. The one here on this plate, the one on plate 71, where the specter swan is, and then plates 48 to 50. And that's where Aaron has a long speech. In all those 3 places, among the daughters of Albion are included, and they would be there anyway, but you get these catalogs of the daughters of Albion, and every time there is Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, as Blake calls them. And maybe he just threw King Lear's daughters in there among the daughters of Albion.
Yeah.
But there seems to be something else going on here. I don't really think it's that, and I'm still just dealing with the Swan Woman here. At this point, I don't know that there's a way to resolve it, but there's the pressure coming from the classical tradition of Pindar through Thomas Gray. And then there's this folklore tradition coming in through King Lear and this conflation of Irish Lear and English Lear. I don't know what to do with that yet.
Yeah.
But there's a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see.
Interesting. David, were you I'm assuming you're responding to Claire's comment. You were talking about the interlinear serpent mirrors it. Is that dark tree a weeping willow? Is it linked to Tyler features so largely in the poem?
She said that, but the other point they're kind of 2 separate points really. The other was that the kind of like does like sort of mirror shapes, and the tree itself seems to sort of droop down into the water rather like the swan. I was just thinking of Tyburn's tree in the poem. Again, I don't know why that would be linked to a swan necessarily, but it could be a sort of imagined morning swan here. Didn't know there's a link to the figure of Jerusalem because of that.
Yeah, there is something very deflationary like with that image, right? Like everything's just kind of like that. I mean, the swan.
Yeah, because often the swan is read. The swan is interpreted as being sad too. And then so I'm reading Sheila Spector's new book now on the development of Blake's myth, and she's got this. Her working premise now is that Blake's got this kind of image act that he's working with. That has, she posits kind of 3 different consciousnesses, right? One that creates the text, one that creates the image, the design, and then a compositor that puts them together. And this is an interesting plate for that, because like so many of them, it's not two images, it's a single image. Because with the fish and everything, I think we're supposed to understand the fish woman to be, I'm calling her fish woman, to be underwater, while the swan is on top, is on the surface of the water. As my wife and I were looking at this last night, though, you start seeing different and the coloring here is so much like the surface of the water. It's almost like she could be skimming along the surface even. Gleckner thinks she's flying, which I don't understand at all.
Well, the first time I saw it, the first time I looked at it, and there's my first impression, and not looking at the fish, there was a sense that she's like this starry goddess flying in the night, but that doesn't go with anything.
Yeah. And if anybody's interested, the reason I keep coming back to Gleckner about all this is that he's got the only essay out there that I've been able to find that just talks about Blake's swans.
Yeah.
It's like from 1981, something like that. Maybe not, maybe even earlier than that.
Well, Sibylla Erla says, the folklore Ireland connection makes me think of the Swan Princess in Swan Lake, but the dates don't match.
Right. And from what I've been able to understand, Swan Lake may be more derived from the Germanic. There are two different folklore traditions, as far as I've been able to tell, European ones at least. There's the Irish, which generally involves 4 siblings, and the German, which tends to involve 6 or 7 siblings. And that's the line that gives us Wagner and Lohengrin and Parzival, and these stories about the Swan Prince. I think this is more the Irish line, because and Blake does distinguish between Erin and Ireland. Erin is the character and Ireland the place. I've about become convinced there's that moment on the beginning of chapter 3 where the sons of Albion basically impose a blockade on Ireland. They surround the 42 ports or something of Ireland. And, the 42 doesn't match up with anything. But I've always thought, this sounded like a blockade. And was there a blockade? I haven't been able to find any reference to a blockade, but I did find a suggestion that this was actually, that Blake was actually misspoke and meant 32, which would match the number of counties in Ireland. And that this might then be a reference to, what was it, the Union Act of 1801? I think, as far as this I'm getting from Robert Essick. I think it's, he's got an essay on Erin and Ireland and something else. But he wants to try and connect it. I think it was the, when England actually formally brought Ireland into the UK. This Union Act of 1801, which I could see how Blake might see that as a blockade.
So lots of comments. So Elizabeth Effinger says, do you have thoughts, Paul, on the swan's expression? Harder to tell what this is. Thinking also here about how this maybe dovetail with that expression on the Birdman's face on plate 78.
Yeah. I don't know whether to make the bird, I don't know if the bird looks sad or not. A lot of people think the bird is sad, a lot of the readers. Like I said, but Erdman thinks it's singing, so I don't really know what to make of any of that. It's a fairly realistic look. I checked several of the other images. Blake almost never colors the bills of the swans, but the coloring of the bill is one of the identifying features for the swans. Assuming this is a London swan, we're almost certainly talking about a mute swan. which are huge. These things are, they're monsters. They're the biggest swan. They're the biggest birds in England. And then what else? What were the other? Let's see.
How this maybe dovetails with that expression on plate 78 of the Birdman.
Yeah. It could well. One thing, they're looking in opposite directions. No, I don't know if that makes any difference or not. And if it is sad, or I don't know, how did we read the Eagle Man or Rooster Man's expression? As contemplative, brooding, and then I think I can't really look at the swan though without seeing the contrast to what looks to me like, I don't know, jubilation of the fish woman. I mean, how do y'all read the fish woman?
Yeah, there's definitely a smile there, right?
I think so. I mean, she looks exuberant.
Right. Not the same kind of dejection or sort of melancholy of the other figures. Although I think the swan does seem harder to read, right? Than plate 78's figure.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not entirely sure this fish is dead.
But
well, I mean, I think it came up, but I mean, there's all these other fish, but I want to say that I was really fascinated when I started finding out about swans' eating habits. That because I assume they eat fish, like geese or something do, or pelicans, but they don't. The only animal life that they eat really is like worms and bugs that are actually just attached to the grass that they eat otherwise. And so I've always kind of seen these things as, I want to believe that Blake was out there watching swans on the Thames, honestly, and that he knew a lot about, I just, if you go back like to the description of the lark in Milton, the way he's such a keen observer of, in some ways animal behavior, just watching just that whole moment of the lark's about to just explode as it gets ready to sing. And I just think Blake probably watched swans eat. He probably knew that they were not particularly carnivoric. And then I just don't know what to do with her, with the fish woman. She's going in the other direction. She seems a lot happier. But
Jennifer Michael compares this in a way with the inversions on the title page of Marriage of Heaven and Hell, with the scenes of above and below.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a version of that.
Yeah. And then once you start noticing this pattern, I mean, I was just sort of thumbing through Jerusalem before we started. And, once you start seeing this pattern of the picture above, text, and then picture below, Blake got to where he liked this pattern a lot. But it's not always, rarely clear how to put them together.
I mean,
Paul, do you feel like the swan is looking directly at you?
Huh.
With the little gleam right there in the center of its eye. I mean, I don't feel like it's dying, but I feel like maybe it's in kind of a submissive position. You feel like recognition of having done something wrong. I don't know. This is what I see.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot of weird about this. But as far as the eye goes, remember that swans are essentially prey animals. So they have prey animal eyes, right, on the sides of their heads rather than the front. And this is the way they look when they eat. But I mentioned, I think last week when we were talking about the Minotaur and how just weirdly rendered Blake's Minotaur is in the Dante illustrations. Remember, it's just a bull with a face.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that in some ways that's this is just how weird it would be to be a swan person. I mean, because it's so awkward to have to eat like this. Yeah, and then the other thing too is that I've become I think that part of Blake's critique of the virgin birth is that he thought it turned Jesus into a demiurge.
Mm.
And that sort of convergence, that sort of hybridization, I think he rejected. For Jesus, for Blake, Jesus is fully human, and that means human conception as well, and not some weird hybrid of a God and a woman. And so there's these weird mixtures that he does of these kind of critiques. I'm not sure what to make of them even.
Michael Measle says she does seem to be flying like a radiant entity in the sky. She does look like she's in the water, but the image around her isn't entirely divorced from the sky in the image above, especially on the top left corner of the plate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, up in here.
And then Rebecca Nesbitt says, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Lear, Lir is the last, what is that? Regnant descendant of Brutus Troy.
Oh.
This is obviously Shakespeare's point, but it doesn't matter to Blake. And then Geoffrey spells it Leir instead of Lir.
Okay. But and there are, it's a like I said, it's a very famous story. I've been able to find pictures of two sculptures of it, one in Dublin and one in Ballycastle, and as well, it was used as an image for stamps.
Yeah. Anise says perhaps a connection between the Tyburn tree that keeps appearing in J and the idea of a stretched neck as a phrase for hanging, and swans with their long stretched necks.
I had not expected that, but gee whiz, ooh. Dark turn there. But entirely possible. Because Tyburn does show up at some of these points as well. And that was actually one of the things I did when we were in London in December, was I found where Tyburn Tree was, which is right there near Hyde Park where all the swans were.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a corner. There's a marker for the tree now, where the tree used to be. The hanging tree was, and there's 3 small trees that have been planted around it, just to mark the spot. It's right there across the street from the big horse's head sculpture there in Hyde Park. It's pretty crazy stuff. I loved it.
David, Elizabeth Evinger kind of points out that there's kind of a wasted environment, post-apocalyptic element to it. If we read the fish is like floating on the water dead, I think that's one way to. And then David, David Fallon says, is it definitely only a lady? I've always thought it was, but looking at it again, it also seems phallic. Those breasts could also be seen as suggesting testicles.
Yeah, so it's the traditional game of Hunt the Willy in Blake illustrations, but assuming they appear in all sorts of strange places. But it could be read as a kind of fusion, not quite hermaphroditic figure, but a kind of combination of the two. I'm not quite sure what you could do with that, but
well, he did a lot more of that kind of work in the Four Zoas. Peter Otto's got some great stuff on that. And then like the trees here. It's interesting just what he does with copy E, because for the way this is generally interpreted, this is a willow here, and these are oaks over here, and I guess the willow of weeping or something, the oaks of the Druids, and but that none of that is at all obvious on the engraved plate. It's just kind of cloudy back there. And this is one of the few white line drawings. So it's not quite the usual etching approach either. So just left, just as printed, it's a very dark plate, just in black ink. When it's printed in monochrome, it's kind of hard to see much of the image.
Yeah, totally. Because that was the one that I posted, was kind of the darker copy.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to get at here, I guess, is that in my book, I talked about Blake's rhetoric of discontinuity, where he interrupts narrative in particular kinds of ways. And if you can learn to figure out how he interrupts that, you can learn to see through them. There's something going on visually, though, that interrupts things as well. And I think we kind of get on a roll with Los, arguing with his specter and things like that. And then all of a sudden we walk up on this. And it's like, this does not fit with anything it does not obviously fit with anything that's going on this plate. And I think that can't be an accident. But it's telling us something else. And that's where I've kind of latched on to Aaron. Everybody seems to identify this plate with Aaron in some way. Gleitner calls it the spaces of Aaron that allow for the creation of Golgonooza on the next plate. Who Warren Stevenson just identifies there's this whole other part of it too. Warren Stevenson identifies the aged pensive woman as Aaron. And I started looking at the aged pensive woman, and she really only shows up twice, and I'm pretty sure it's Aaron. I think Stevenson is right about that. But her job seems to just be watching the grave of Albion. That she's there just watching ceaselessly, unceasingly. And I don't know how. That connection to the Irish Lear is the only way the swan fits, that I can make this swan fit so far. But I'm not sure I'm convinced yet.
So Rebecca had a pretty interesting follow-up to the Lear thing. It says, in Geoffrey, we don't have an Irish L-I-R versus English L-E-A-R. We have L-E-I-R, King of Britannia. He's located in Leicester, but the Welsh historian Geoffrey's whole project is to create a history for Britain that goes back to Troy. How does that work with England's green and pleasant land? If that indeed might be a source.
Well, I do think that Blake makes probably more than Trojan Brutus deserves, because even by Milton's time, nobody believed that. Nonetheless, he uses it, and I think that Blake. And I wrote about this ages ago, that I think Blake basically realized or decided that England had hooked its chariot to the wrong tradition, to the classical tradition, and therefore bought into the Homeric narrative style, all the things that came with Homer. When instead we should have been following the Bible, and there was precedent for that because of Trojan Brutus. And even Alexander Pope has a very little brief fragment about Trojan Brutus. Blake has an engraving of the early one of Brutus coming to England. Or that early engraving that he then adapted, that he then turned into Brutus. And then there's another one of not Brutus, but somebody preaching maybe Jesus preaching to the early Christians. supposedly in England. So I think that, you know, that's where that bit fits. I don't know. Part of it, I think that Blake's trying to figure out the geography too. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but I think that as the watcher, Ireland and Erin serves as this barrier between Albion and the Atlantic Ocean. You know, I mean, there's something about Erin protecting Albion throughout the poem. And that's the only thing I can see how it might work.
Thanks.
I would welcome any ideas.
David talks a little bit about phalluses, more about the phallus, but he doesn't want to continue pushing the point. But it reminds me of, oh, go ahead, David.
So I was going to say, I think is a swan. I think the swan's one of the prohibited things to eat for the Israelites. So I don't know whether it has its.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good point. I've been through all this stuff. There swans are mentioned twice in the Torah. Once in Leviticus and once in Deuteronomy, as you might guess. And they are forbidden. They're not kosher. But the consensus seems to be that they're not really talking about swans, that they probably didn't have any swans in Egypt. And so they're much more likely talking about ibises. You know, apparently all the Hebrew says is big white birds, which is one of the things that I've been kind of weird finding out too. Like even in Horace, we mentioned Horace earlier, and somebody suggested the Horatian reference. I went back last night just to check the Latin, you know, and because the original rare bird, the original Rara avis, is from Juvenal, and it's a black swan. But it gets even weirder than that, because that image is used in Juvenal's just tirade against the women of Rome, and said basically that a virtuous woman in Rome is as rare as a black swan. Is the way it shows up. But I went to check the Latin to see what he called it, what Horace called the swan, because it's not Cygnus. And I went back and he actually just says album alitum, which is just a white bird. But somehow or another that gets translated as swan. Oh yes, Claire, I just finished the Swan book. It was crazy. I loved it. I will never be the same.
It's such a good book though, because it's not, I think like Blake, and you know, the epigraph to the Swan book is, yeah. She's an Indigenous Australian writer who's like, I think Blakean in that there's all these different levels of time and the imagination.
Oh, yeah.
And also she's like Blake, I think, beyond good and evil. Like there's no notion of purity, like, because even though Blake is all about England's green and pleasant land, the minute you go back, right, there's all these fractal timelines out of empire. And I've been like, I think the association of swans with the Thames, right, for Blake is partly, that's the Blake of nationalism, right? But it's also the Blake of, you know, that I think they're ambivalent because they're birds of empire as well for him, right? I mean, they have to be, surely, right? In England with the sumptuary laws around swans, right? So there's always in Blake getting back to England, but there's also something mildly toxic, right, about a certain type of, even for Blake, right? Mate?
Yeah, well, and y'all know about swan upping?
Right. Well, that was what I was going to. Yeah, that's why I kept saying they're political animals, right? They're animals of royalty, right? They're priests.
Technically, in England, all the swans that are not owned by either the vintners or the dyers belong to the crown, and are protected by the crown.
Yeah, and that was true in Blake's time, right? So,
yeah. It was even worse back then.
Yeah.
And now it's a very limited thing, but they still do the swan upping. I think it's in July.
Yeah.
Where they gather up the swans in a certain part of the Thames and mark the ones that aren't marked yet. And they either have to, anyone that's not marked belongs to the Crown. And the only two guilds that are authorized to own swans are the vintners and the dyers.
Yeah.
Like crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is that royal connection, and that's the other thing I haven't really factored into this yet either.
Right. Isn't it? I mean, because in that plate you've got one bird, downward, and then the bird at the bottom looking upward, right? And everything in Blake is sort of seems always to be poised between
and then
falling back.
Next.
Yeah, and falling back, right, becoming what you've struggled to emerge from, and emerging, right? The narrative is never in one direction. Every time every act of revolution is also an act of piety in Blake, right? So, and I think that's why this bird, it's a bird of flight, but it's falling down, right? But at the bottom, right, there's one, and then there's all these hybrid animals in between, in the marginal animals, right?
Actually, if you look at the text on the plate, which we haven't really talked much about, but the text on the plate really, this is the plate that includes, if the plate before is the one, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man.
Yeah.
This one has the line about delivering individuals from systems. Striving with systems to deliver individuals from those. And then the next thing that happens is the emergence of Aaron from the furnaces.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what's going on here, is that emergence from, the liberation from whatever the confinement of the swan or something.
Well, this was bizarre and awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you everyone for coming in and talking about swans. Next week we have an off week, but we'll be back in 2 weeks with Debbie Lee. So I hope to see you then.
Thanks for letting me rattle on about this. I really appreciate it.
It was awesome.
It was fun.
Bye.
Bye.
This is the problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition,